the presentation focus for the day, which are Gandhi's strategies, kind of an introduction to what I describe as Brahmacharya, Sarvodaya, and Satyagraha. These are complex, and especially regarding Satyagraha, we will come back next week as we carry on next Thursday with more detail. And we will have far more discussion relating to the guidelines Gandhi presented for nonviolent resistance. The guidelines are very consistent with his worldview, which is why we are looking at the worldview first. But it may be that you may disagree with many of these ideas, and that will be your right. It is good. So, is there anything you would like to talk about before we begin? So far, we have mentioned that the Gambia is celebrating its 60th year of independence from the British. And I have learned that groundnuts, peanuts, are still their primary export. Though I understand the Chinese are being very thorough at harvesting teak wood and also overfishing the river and the ocean. I think the Gambia is one place with the United States has not done too much damage yet. But there is still time. As the US competes with the Chinese, perhaps the Gambia will experience some of what much of the world has seen.
Well, not to cut you short, but we've experienced enough in the hands of the Chinese.
Yes.
Through exploited as much as almost 30 to 40% of our timber. And this has caused a lot of tensions, particularly between the southern part of the Gambia, the southern part of Senegal, which is Casamance, and then also the southern part of the Gambia, which is very close to the borderlines. So if you know, the Gambia and Senegal has a very porous borders, meaning you can walk through Gambia, go to Senegal, walk through Senegal, come to Gambia. So they have very porous borders. And as such, a lot of timber exploitation has been happening around that area. So some of these evidences are on the media. You can be able to check them out and then see the amount of exploitations that has been carried out.
Yes, well, it is certainly true that in the colonial times, the French, the Spanish, the British, the Portuguese, they all had different styles, but they were all exploiting resources for their own gain. In more modern times, neo-colonial powers like the United States, China, and I would say Russia, and others do much the same thing, though it may not involve direct political control. It is still generally economic exploitation. So whatever I might say that is critical of the United States, I am certainly willing to say and be critical of the Chinese, the Russians, and others. We don't need empires, in my opinion. And we're still fighting for independence in many ways. To the extent that the Gambia is economically being exploited by other powers, it is not truly independent. It needs to be, of course, Gambia for Gambians, not for the Chinese.
Right, like I mentioned the other time, sometimes the policies and the practices are always different. And as such, this also brings about conflict of interest as to which one do we prioritize. Do we prioritize the policies or the programs? And sometimes with the kind of systems they come in place, some of these African leaders would not be able to resist because they pump in a lot of foreign policies. They bring in a lot of restrictions. They bring a lot of conditions, particularly with their loans. So for the next 50 years, there are certain loans that the Gambia and many other countries, particularly African countries and even some Asian countries, will be paying on the programs they come in place with. So I think these are some of the things that the discourse has to be around, and then see how best as young individuals who are working around these advocacies would be able to address themselves with, and then see possible means to be able to tackle some of these challenges that are happening around the world, particularly in our various countries, towns and cities.
Yeah, and the Gambia is not alone. Um, Economic nationalism, which is advocated by Donald Trump, and I would suggest also by the Chinese, is certainly willing to make people dependent upon their loans. The loans can be loans from governments, can be loans from private banks and multinational corporations that expect their governments to protect them. That is also a form of economic nationalism. And of course, it can be the International Monetary Fund or World Bank, which the United States and Europe have been particularly good at manipulating for their benefit. Uh, so we are back to Gandhi. What would Gandhi do about this? Uh, from our last session yesterday, he would probably say, it's important for you to seek Swadeshi, economic self-reliance, and Swaraj, self-rule. Today, we are looking at strategies. And we will look at these for about 40, 50 minutes. It's very complex, and so this will not be as detailed as it could be. And then we will have time for discussion. The first strategy, which is Brahmacharya, it is sometimes basically translated as celibacy, but it is much, much more than that for Gandhi. Brahmacharya is the primary focal strategy for achieving moksha, which is self-realization, which of course involves the seeking of truth and the understanding of Ra, which is the ultimate reality. And so you can see how this flows from the philosophical to the belief, to the goals, to the strategy. The religious philosophical culmination is Brahmacharya. Now, here, and this is so that whatever I say may be more easily taken with notes. So, first, Brahmacharya includes, for Gandhi, the yogic yamanamas and niyamas. Now, this is simply a fancy way of saying that to practice Brahmacharya, you must be committed to ahimsa, nonviolence, satya, truth, and you need to refuse to steal. Thou shalt not steal. You need to control your five senses. That is part of what Brahmacharya is about. And of course, you should not hoard. Do not take more than your fair share of the resources. Basically, Brahmacharya includes many of the concepts that we've discussed in earlier sessions. I think it's helpful to understand that ultimately, again, Gandhi would say the means become the end. By not focusing on the five senses, you can focus upon the Spirit of God, the soul that is within you, and better surrender to that soul and basically be a peacemaker in this world. You can be the change you want to see if you are not possessed by your possessions. um, there is, I think, helpful to understand so that we're not just looking at uh, the narrow concept, becoming learned of God. There are many ways to do that. In Hindu worldview, and Gandhi understood this, of course, there are four distinctive paths to God. And I mentioned this in the outline. There is Jnana Yoga, which is the way to God through knowledge and study. Bhakti Yoga, which is the way through devotion and religious practices. There is Karma Yoga, which is the way to God through work or through fulfilling duties associated with your life, physical activity and service. And there is Raja Yoga, which is the way to God through kind of traditional yoga, controlling the breath, controlling the heartbeat, meditating. Uh, for Raja Yoga, you can be, of course, in a cave somewhere in the Himalayas. Uh, most Hindus would say all four of these paths can get you to the mountaintop, can help you achieve moksha. But most people practice more than one. And so it's a matter of the blending of the paths that I find of interest. I would suggest that Gandhi was primarily a karma yogi. That is, he did worship. There was bhakti. He had prayers twice a day, and he engaged in some jnana yoga. That is, he did read, he did study a little, but I would say over 70% of his path was that of a servant leader. You come to God through service of others. That was his perhaps chosen path. Maybe that was simply appropriate to him and his disposition, his personality. Uh, you can have many other uh, mixes. My wife is more bhakti yogi. Most people who are traditionally Christian or Muslim will engage in prayer as a central part of their life. Prayer was important for Gandhi, but his actions were his primary prayer. Um, he would say, "My life is my message of what I am doing." The Karma Yoga is a doer. What I am doing is I'm walking on my path to God through service of others. Um, of course, he was a renunciant, which is common in many traditions. Most Christian saints are renunciants, that is, they renounce worldly possessions. They often have no private property. They become teachers and mystics of some kind. That tradition is present in many other traditions. Uh, and we can get into some of these details if you're interested. What I would like to emphasize is that for Gandhi, Brahmacharya, truthfulness, nonviolence, willingness to sacrifice, refusal to steal from others, basically includes many of what we would describe as the Ten Commandments. It was primarily ethical for Gandhi, though it crucially does include control of the five senses. Before we go on to Sarvodaya, I think it's important to see why Gandhi considered this to be so important um, in his personal life. Um, We learn about the world through what we see, feel, taste, touch, and smell, the five senses. But that is only material reality. That is always changing, as we mentioned before. For Gandhi, to see beyond the five senses is to really have greater glimpses of the absolute truth that is God. Um, how do you do that? Well, you need to control the senses rather than allow the senses to control you. You need to take some time to meditate, but also think. Uh, I eat to live. I don't live to eat. I need to remind myself of that sometimes. I could lose a lot of weight. But many of us almost live to eat. We live to consume. We live to have things. We're possessed by our possessions. Gandhi would say there's nothing wrong with eating, but eat to live. Eat your fair share of the world's resources. Eat healthy to take care of the body as an instrument of God's peace. It is the vehicle that the soul is using in this world to travel. So you need to take care of your body. But live to eat is not the way. Eating to live is the way. Does that make sense? There's nothing wrong with having sex to procreate, to have the human race continue to survive. But you have sex to procreate. You don't simply procreate to have sex. It should not be, for Gandhi, the focus of your attention. If you're preoccupied with your sexual desires, it's the same way as being preoccupied with eating sweets and being addicted to sweets. It's being controlled by your passions. And Gandhi would say it's crucial to control your passions in order to be able to seek higher understandings of what real reality is. So I won't beat that into the ground, but let us just mention that in Hindu practice, there is a power that comes from Brahmacharya, not just celibacy, but controlling of all the five senses. Um, Yogis who practice Raja Yogi, for example, the physical practices, can control their breath down to 2 or 3 breaths per minute. They can slow their heartbeat down to 2 or 3 beats per minute. They can be medically dead and then come back to life. Such highly developed yogis, and Gandhi was not taking that path, but are said to be able to do apparently miraculous things. There's a certain power to the God force within you that you might access by being a highly developed yogi. And of course, you don't develop that soul force power by simply seeking to have it. It's not a possession to be had, but it is a consequence of practices that allow you to surrender to the Spirit of God within you. And then, as St. Francis of Assisi might say, you become an instrument of God's peace. We'll come back to what soul force might actually include, but it is apparently miraculous. I'm confusing you. One of the differences that we'll see with Martin Luther King relates to the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Many of you know that biblical story where Daniel, a Jew, a servant of God, surrenders to the will of God and refuses to obey orders of a king to renounce God. He is thrown into a den of lions. The story says that the lions are overcome and do not attack Daniel, that God intervenes and protects Daniel. Now, Gandhi, or someone like him, would say, what Daniel did was surrender to the light of God within him, literally surrender to the soul, allowing the soul to shine in his presence. And the lions were not stopped by God from attacking. From Gandhi's point of view, what happened was the soul within Daniel and the Spirit of God, the soul within the lions, were enlightened to see that they were not different. That is, the lion and I are one and the same. We are members of God's creation. And when the lions were forced to reflect upon their behavior in the light of God, they voluntarily did not attack Daniel, because to do so would be like chewing off their own paws, chewing off their own feet. They wouldn't do that. They weren't coerced by God. They weren't physically forced by God. From Gandhi's point of view, a person who surrenders to God, and this is more able to be done by someone practicing Brahmacharya. Someone surrendering to God is capable of having their self defended by soul force. That is, the lions will not attack you. Gandhi would suggest that if someone was a highly, highly developed spiritual person, such a person could communicate over distances. Well, Mr. Gandhi, tell me, how would you defend against nuclear weapons if a pilot is flying 30,000 feet in the air and is about to drop a nuclear bomb upon you? How do you stop them, Gandhi? What good is your soul force then? Gandhi's response to that, after the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was to say, I would pray to the spirit of the pilot in the plane to reflect upon what they are doing and to voluntarily refuse to obey their orders. That sounds really stupid. How do your prayers impact a pilot 30,000 feet in the air? Well, Gandhi would say soul force. In the same way that Daniel could disarm the lions, we can disarm the pilot. We'll come back to that, but that's a very strange idea, yes? Sarvodaya is much more down to earth. Sarvodaya is the primary strategy for achieving Swadeshi, economic self-reliance. Sarvodaya includes engaging in what Gandhi described as constructive programs. It will also relate to other things that we'll discuss on this outline, but I think, Harshal, you might have a very simple piece on constructive program. There we go. And you can read this if I'm getting a little bit boring. I found this listing of 18 constructive programs that Gandhi developed in the 1930s. Gandhi believed that fundamentally, if we rule ourselves, that is, allow our soul to rule our body, if we ourselves can rule over us. So the primary problem is not the British as a colonial power. The primary problem is we who accept British rule. Once we refuse to accept British rule and rule ourselves, the British will have to leave. As at least colonizers, they will have to leave. How do you do that? Well, Gandhi would say first, a divided house against itself cannot stand. So the first constructive program was communal unity. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh unity. Or wherever you are, all of the different fragmentations of your society need to be unified. You need to develop personal relationships outside of your group. Hindus and Muslims, for Gandhi, need to become friends, not just allies. They need to become like brothers and sisters to one another. Unification of the population will allow them to collectively say, we rule ourselves, thank you. You are not welcome to rule us. He also believed that what he called the sin of untouchability needs to be eliminated. This outcasting of people who are other than you is, of course, distinctive in Hindu culture relating to the caste system and being outcast from the four major caste categories. Oftentimes, untouchables were, of course, seen as literally untouchable. They do work traditionally that might be taking away dead cow carcasses or sweeping the streets or cleaning the bathrooms. And they were considered to be polluting to caste Hindus, especially Brahmins, so that even if an untouchable were to cross your path with their shadow, the Brahmin would need to do spiritual rituals to clean himself from that pollution of the shadow. Now, we can, of course, just focus on Hinduism, but casteism is present in different manifestations in many places. Usually it relates to racism. In the United States, a book has been written relating to caste in the United States, primarily focusing on the traditions of cultural supremacy that, of course, supported slavery and have since then supported segregation and extreme separation of races. So for Gandhi, whatever caste may be in your culture, you need to unite and remove this sin of prejudice and bias within yourselves. If you are divided in yourself, in your attitude towards other people, of other religions, of other cultures, then you yourself are not able to stand with them and resist the abuse of authority. We could go on and on, 18 different categories. The BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, tends to focus on constructive program that includes village sanitation, for example. That, of course, was on the list. It's important, but it's not for Gandhi as important as, let's say, Ney Talim, the new education policy that he had thought of. To educate the young to be anti-colonial, to educate the young to be able to be self-reliant and have self-esteem is crucial. And Gandhi experimented at Sevagram Ashram, his last home in India, with a Netalim school. In his time, that Netalim school was being organized and led by Marjorie Sykes. Marjorie Sykes was a Quaker woman from England who I spent in Christmas, December 1971. Marjorie Sykes would tell me about the practice of Netalim. And if you're interested in Gandhi's educational philosophy, that is part of Sarvodaya. That is part of a program to provide welfare to all. Netalim would envision schools that would be self-sustaining. They would often have students working in the fields, or maybe working to produce milk for milk cows, or it might be working to spin cloth to be able to sell the cloth in the marketplace. And the school would be self-sustaining. The students would work and learn at the same time. They would work side by side with the teachers. It's like a learning community for everyone. They would learn skills that would give them employment. They would make money at the school to sustain the school itself so that there would be no fee for the students. They would not, education wouldn't cost anything. And of course, they would learn in their native language, and they would also usually learn a national language so they could communicate with others. They would learn history and the basic subjects that we normally would associate with education. But what is very different about a Netalim school is the way it is organized. Teachers and students together, working together, sustaining the school together, and making it a community which is united across caste, religious, and race lines. I don't want to go too much more into that, but if you're interested, we can. Sarvodaya, of course, is the overall including of all of these constructive programs, is a word that Gandhi himself created. Sarvodaya means the welfare of all. Think of that. The welfare of all is practicing nonviolence towards all. How is that different? Well, in Western liberalism, typically it's the greatest good for the greatest number. Gandhi doesn't believe the greatest good for the greatest number. He believes in the greatest good for everyone, the welfare of all. He's not a Western liberal. We need to distinguish him in that way. He's not a utilitarian. You don't judge how good a policy is by how useful it may be for the most people. For Gandhi, you don't really know what's useful until after you're already practicing the policy. And that's good. You can experiment. But basically, you need to not judge the policy by its end. You need to judge the means that will become the end. For Gandhi, again, you practice democracy and then you get democracy. You must practice democracy in your school. You must practice democracy in your workplace. You need to practice democracy in your family. So Sarvodaya, the welfare of all, is Gandhi's primary means of implementing Swadeshi. It is the means to the end, achieving the goal of self-reliance. Now, in the next, well, let's stop for a moment. Is there anything that you would like to discuss relating to Brahmacharya or Sarvodaya?
Michael, I have a question. Can
Yes, of course. Yes.
Michael, here in point number 12, there is a national language. What is
Yes.
national language?
Well, Gandhi
Because
did
the thing is that when Gandhi is talking about the rural development, right? The rural
Yes.
development. So
Yes.
India doesn't have any national language. We have different languages for each state, each region, right? There is no national language. with a national language. And in the other part, he's talking about the local welfare. Then why this national language came?
Well, again, this is both and. For Gandhi, it's not either or. He's not being binary here. It's not that you should only learn your local language and no other. He does think it's important to have a national language to unite the nation. He would say that in organizing at the local level, including in your Natalim schools, the local language should be used. But as you're learning using your local language, Gandhi would say there should be a national language. And you should discuss what that could be. It might be Hindi, which of course is politically controversial in India. It might be English in Canada, which is controversial because in Quebec they have French. But if you want to have a united Canada, a united India, you need to respect multiple languages, but still, Gandhi would say, it's helpful to have a national language. It's both and. In the United States, your mother tongue might be Spanish. My adopted daughter is from Mexico. She didn't learn English until she came to the United States. Her first language is Spanish. It's important for her to keep that language. But it is also important for her in the United States to learn English, which is the dominant language, for better or for worse, so that she can communicate with other people. It's both and. Does that make sense to you?
Yes,
Shushil?
yes, Michael. The thing is that actually, why can't a Telugu a national language in India? Why can't a classical language, Tamil, a national language? Why can't a Malayalam? Because in most of the South India, most of the native languages are classical languages older than Hindi. For example, if we take Urdu,
Mm-hmm.
Urdu is around 300 years old language, popularized by last Mughal Bahadur Shah Zafar. And Hindi is not an older as a classical language of Tamil or Malayalam or Telugu. So if you want to impose so the regional speaking people won't accept that. So this is a problem.
Well, it is a problem. And Gandhi doesn't believe in imposing anything. You understand? He wouldn't impose Hindi upon South India. On the other hand, isn't it helpful for people who speak Malayalam when they go to Delhi to be able to speak Hindi? How disunited India would be if people only spoke their local language. If you don't like Hindi, then perhaps come up with another new language or make English your national language. But that, of course, is controversial too because it's the language of the colonial power. Why are you fighting, Gandhi would say, over your local languages? Why cannot you reunite and see that you should decide to have one language to communicate with one another? It is a problem. It's a problem if you have 18 major language groups and two major scripts, and they don't allow for communication amongst them. That's a problem. Gandhi wanted to unite against the British. How can you do that if you can't even talk with each other? It's a very practical thing. Thank you for raising the question. I know it's controversial. But Gandhi is not trying to impose anything. He's simply suggesting programs that will help us become more united. And similar problems might be happening, in Nigeria. There are different tribal groupings, yes? I'm old enough to remember a horrible, horrible civil war in Nigeria between dominant and less dominant tribal groups. For Nigeria to survive as a country, they need to have some unification and go beyond the tribal groupings. What Gandhi called for Hindu-Muslim unity in India might look very different in Nigeria. But Nigeria needs to unite its people on a basis of a common humanity, not try to control by one tribe over another. That cannot be forced. It will not last. So Gandhi is mostly stating the obvious, and the most obvious is develop relationships. Don't only speak with Christians if you're a Christian. Have dinner with other people of different religious faiths, different races, different tribal groupings. Mix. And perhaps Gandhi's more controversial suggestions toward the end of his life was castes should overcome casteism by mixing in marriage. That was not well received by Brahmins. But you need to unite to see that you are all one family, divided by religion, race, different cultures, languages. You need to unite. See your common humanity. That is Sarvodaya. When it comes to Satyagraha, the concept is fairly simple, the practice is not. This is a word that Gandhi also created. It didn't exist before Gandhi. Sat means truth, agraha means holding firm to. So basically, Satyagraha is a strategy to see it. But it's important to see that you hold firm to the truth as you see it at any point in time, always being open to learning new insights from others and changing your truth over time. So Gandhi's Satyagraha concept is intimately related to his belief in Sat being both absolute and relative at the same time, that truth can only be achieved through practicing degrees of nonviolence. And a Satyagrahi, one who practices Satyagraha, must at least renounce the willingness to kill other people. Mbai, I see your hand is raised, but I don't see everything. So please unmute if you like and enter into a conversation.
Yes, because you were responding to some questions or contributions raised, and I do not want to interrupt at the time.
That's okay.
Yeah.
What would you like to say?
Exactly. So just to contribute on Sarvodaya, because this is an important aspect of which myself have been preview to see in India, especially in a village called Salosora. This is a very small village of about approximately 15,000 thereabout inhabitants. So this is also a genesis of Gandhi, where I understood he had played a major part, an area he has lived during the period he was growing up in his advocacy and activism. So you will see that community, it has a community school, and now it has up to a university. But the kind of programs they have there are self-reliant programs, meaning from the day you enter the school, your uniform, your books, and everything is being taken care of by the school. And how do they do this? Because they have school gardens, and they have a very big orchard where they do a lot of agricultural practices. And in return, the community itself is even coming. And as such, even by extension, other communities are also coming there to have what we call agricultural extension programs, where they train them on fertilizers, handling, on a lot of things on agricultural practices. And I think this is also something that is important to at least have consideration of, because if, for example, like we were talking about Gambia's independence, economically not independent, how do we be able to instill some of these things into our cultures, into our communities, for instance, and how do we get out of some of the circles that we are within in order to be able to develop, but also to bring about growth in terms of programs. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good concrete example of Ne Talim, one of the constructive programs of Sarvodaya, which is to the benefit of the welfare of all. Gandhi wanted to practice and experiment in the local areas, building community. And it is for the local community to decide what product to produce, to provide the necessary resources, to provide the education. The local community will decide the curriculum, what courses will be taught. And of course, it is the local language that will be used because that is what allows people to communicate with each other, right? So Gandhi is very practical, but it's extremely decentralized. Gandhi wants people to practice what they preach, and they should be preaching the welfare of all. That is, everyone in the community should have access. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Jains, Marxists, they should all be able to be at the school, and they interact and they learn with one another. Yes? That is the future we want to see. Now, if the government or those who are in power do not allow you to practice what you want to see in the future, you must resist it. Satyagraha is the resistance side of Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya is constructive program. If you're building the new society, you can build and build and build, and eventually it will take over the old society. But it is expected that there will be resistance. And so when you have resistance, especially from governments or from privileged people within your society, then you need to have Satyagraha to help you achieve Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya is saying, yes, build community, build community, build community. Satyagraha is saying, no, resist authority when authority is oppressive. You cannot build community if you're a colonial subject. You must throw off colonialism. You cannot be truly independent if the Chinese are taking all of your lumber from the Gambia, all of your teak wood. Throw off the Chinese. There is a resistance element to Gandhi, which is very practical. Resistance is reluctant. Gandhi would love to see the new future world evolve through the practice of Sarvodaya and constructive program. But he is practical enough to know that a lot of people will not like this. A lot of people will try to smash you and stop you from building that new future. resistance is necessary. So hold firm to the truth as you see it at any point in time. You listen to your opponents and others always so that you can learn from the other blind men who are touching the elephant. You're always willing to change your truth and hold firm to a new truth. And so in some ways, Satyagraha is a nonviolent equivalent to Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where Hegel hypothesized that there would always be kind of a dominant thesis that will be opposed by people in its time with contrary ideas and antithesis, and these would be conflicting. And out of the conflict, there can be a new synthesis, a new idea, a new concept, a new policy. So Gandhi's approach to Satyagraha is not, I have the truth and you must share it with me. He's not saying that. He's saying, I am holding firm to what I believe to be true. But I am open to learning with you. If you think I am wrong, show me. And I will perhaps modify my view of what is true. It's a dynamic, changing thing. But Satyagraha requires nonviolence because if my opponent and others are afraid of me, they will not communicate with me. I will not learn from them, and there can be no then growth towards truth. So Satyagraha is practiced by people who are willing to fight. They're a different kind of soldier. A Satyagrahi is a soldier resisting oppressive authority, willing to sacrifice, undertake tapas, go to jail, civil disobedience, endure other kinds of abuse as a means of showing the love you have for others so that we can collectively move towards truth. I don't know if you can get that very easily, but I did send another little slide, that one, very good. And this is my handwriting, it's not very good. But remember when we discussed about nonviolence, where there was perfect nonviolence and perfect violence, and there's an upwards hierarchical scale. If we go on the bottom side of this slide, the lower part, you can recall that perfect violence maybe can be achieved at the time of death if you are a perfect coward. And for Gandhi, doing something is always better than doing nothing. Don't be a coward. Don't be humiliated. Don't allow anyone to damage your self-respect. You must stand up for the self, the soul that is within you, holding firm to whatever truth you have. And if that means flying airplanes into the World Trade Center in New York City and you're a terrorist, Gandhi would say, terrorism is more nonviolent than cowardice. That's very controversial to say. Gandhi would have some respect even for the terrorist. At least they're willing to die for what they believe. They have courage. Now, a regular military soldier will not kill non-combatants. So a regular military soldier is more nonviolent than a terrorist. And Gandhi is encouraging people to go up the scale. Be a regular soldier, enlist if that's what you think is right. Gandhi himself would form an ambulance corps during the Boer War and the Zulu Rebellion in South Africa. And he would be a non-combatant without weapons, treating the injured. He received medals for that. Gandhi didn't care about the medals, he cared about being a servant to all. He was acting in the welfare of all. Now, at some point on this scale, remember you're always both violent and nonviolent at the same time. At some point, about halfway up, you're more nonviolent than violent. And there is where Gandhi will sometimes say, you're practicing nonviolence. You know, he goes back to kind of a binary way of talking because you're more nonviolent than violent. Now, that can be tactical nonviolence. In Satyagraha, which is only one of many different approaches to nonviolent direct action, but Gandhi's Satyagraha can be tactical and it can be principled. You can see that there's a scale still. Some people don't like Gandhi's religious formulations and his discussion of Brahmacharya and moksha and ultimate reality, and they just want to focus on tactics. Well, Gandhi would say, okay, that's where you can practice, you can relate to, that's fine. Maybe your name is Gene Sharp and you're at Harvard University and you write books about Gandhian Satyagraha as tactics. It's simply tactics. And you do case studies showing how Gandhi fasted here or he engaged in a strike there. He refused to pay the salt tax during the Salt March. And these are all tactics, tactics, tactics. If you focus on tactics, then you never have to mention God. You never really have to mention soul. You just are pragmatically saying nonviolent resistance can get results. Gandhi himself, though, would probably say, I'm happy, Gene Sharp, that you have written these books called The Power of Nonviolence, 3 volumes, hundreds of case studies. That's very good. But Gene Sharp and others like him, you don't really understand me, Gandhi would say, because I am about soul force. Even the terrorist has some soul force. The military soldier has some soul force. The person who practices tactical nonviolence has greater soul force. But if you want to see soul force really shine and have the power that I'm talking about, that requires principled nonviolence. Such people refuse to accept physical destructive weapons, even if they have access to them. Those who are practicing principled nonviolence have beaten their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, and they're not making war anymore. Such people are true satyagrahis, and their soul force may exhibit qualities that the others may not be able to see. If you allow yourself to surrender to the light of God within you, that light can become part of your presence. And it can disarm lions in a den of lions. St. Francis of Assisi had this kind of soul force when he walked out into the woods surrounding his city in Italy and confronted a man-eating wolf that was terrorizing the people in the city. The people went out to see what Francis was doing, and they found him standing next to this huge wolf that had been killing people, and he was petting the wolf like it was a pet dog. The wolf was at peace. That is soul force. Soul force is ultimately not physical. It's the power, the creative power of God to enlighten us to see the unity that is behind all of the material foolishness that separates us. I think perhaps the last thing I will mention before we have more discussion, if you like, is a story. Um, the story comes from South Africa, and it is January of 1908. Before 1908, Satyagraha did not exist as an idea. Gandhi was talk about his nonviolence movement as passive resistance. Sometimes he would call it duragraha, which is stubborn persistence. I mean, it was nonviolence in both cases, but he comes up with the word satyagraha after he has what I would describe as a near-death experience. This might shock you a little, but I want you to know that for Gandhi, the existence of soul was not simply a philosophical or religious belief. He believes he actually experienced it when he was literally killed and came back to life. Here's the circumstance. Gandhi is leading a movement against the Black Acts in South Africa, the laws that were segregating, nullifying their marriages, requiring them to carry passbooks in order to be able to go from one geographic area to another. And Gandhi had pledged to die rather than to register under the Black Acts. Gandhi had then come to an agreement with his opponent, Jan Smuts. Jan Smuts told Gandhi, if you agree to voluntarily register, I will then, as the head of the government, repeal the very laws that you're opposing. But you must allow me to save face. You register first, and I will repeal the laws, and you will win. Well, Gandhi accepted that, went to a mass meeting, and he announces his agreement with Jan Smuts. And of course, Gandhi was seen as a traitor by many people. He had pledged to die rather than register under this law. Now he's saying, I'm going to register and give Jan Smuts the benefit of my doubt. A man stood up at this mass meeting. He happened to be a Muslim man, a man who would be from the Pathan tribal group in Afghanistan, a very large man by the name of Mir Alim. Mir Alim says, Mr. Gandhi, I pledge to kill the first person who registers under this law. There's silence throughout the room. Gandhi says, I will be that first person. I have given my word to Jan Smuts, and I will register under the law. You will need to kill me. Again, Gandhi is always a general living by example, asking no one to do something that he is unwilling to do. As Gandhi is walking to the registration place, Mir Alim comes and he beats Gandhi unconscious. The physical evidence is Gandhi had 3 teeth broken, 4 ribs broken, was beaten unconscious and left for dead. This is January of 1908. Gandhi could have been killed at the age of 39, which ironically is about the same time that Martin Luther King was killed. Gandhi was taken for dead, and he was carried, his body was carried to the home of a Baptist minister. That minister tended to his wounds, and Gandhi comes back to life. He comes away. Later, immediately Gandhi said, where is Mir Alim? Where is Mir Alim? Oh, well, he's been arrested. And Gandhi's response was, well, have him released. Have him released. He made a promise to kill me, and he tried. He's an honorable person. I forgive him. And then the next week, Gandhi is writing in his journal, and this is what is really strange. In English, so there is no error in translation, Gandhi writes, one feels pain only after one returns to one's body. Hmm? You felt pain only after you returned to your body? Where were you, Gandhi? Later, in later articles, he writes, I came into the presence of a light, brilliant as 1,000 suns, an all-compassionate, loving force. That light asks, are you prepared to die? Have you lived well? This loving light, which Gandhi identified with God, does not judge your behavior. It requires you to judge yourself. You're reflecting upon your own life. Have you lived well? Gandhi becomes conscious and believes that the light he saw was the light of God. He believes that his soul was outside of his body, experiencing the presence of God. For the last 40 years of Gandhi's life, he had no fear because he believed this experience was real and that death itself is an illusion. One feels pain only after one returns to one's body. After this experience in January of 1908, Gandhi creates the word Satyagraha, soul force. And ultimately, his objective is to not coerce the opponent, but to convert them by your willingness to suffer and die if necessary. His objective is to be the light of God, as he had seen the light of God, which asks, have you lived well? Are you happy with the way you are behaving? The Satyagrahi is a who is requiring his opponents to reflect upon their lives. He's not trying to coerce them into doing something against their will. He's not going to require a national language. The Satyagrahi, male or female, has the same soul, and the soul, Gandhi believes, is capable of immense power to force others to reflect upon their lives and to live better lives as a consequence. Now, you can become a believer in nonviolent direct action, and it's only tactics. And you can be like um, Gene Sharp, the Harvard University professor. You don't need to believe in soul for that. But to understand Gandhi and Satyagraha as he saw it, you need to accept that there is something beyond this world that is in you, God. That you're not just see, feel, taste, touch, smell, five senses to learn. There is an internal God, spirit, soul within you, a drop of water that, if you're in touch with it, can give you immense ability to change the world for the better. It doesn't require numbers. Even one sufficiently developed Satyagrahi, Gandhi would say, can change the entire course of history. The strength of the movement does not depend upon it being a mass movement. The more the merrier. It's a great learning process. But ultimately, Gandhi would say, it is the quality of the Satyagrahi power to change. And you can be just one and change the course of history. What do you think about that? We still have a few minutes to our time together. Would you say Gandhi is a crazy guy? Martin Luther King would later say, well, Daniel in the lion's den, that was just a story. If you go into a den of hungry lions, you're going to be eaten. Nonviolence needs to have a much more coercive element. First, you cage the lions, then you retrain them, and maybe then you can live with them. Gandhi would say, well, that's one way of doing it. But ultimately, you can have soul-to-soul communication with animals, whether it's a hungry wolf in the woods outside of Assisi in Italy, or whether it's poisonous snakes, or whether it is a lion. Because you're all part of God's creation. Soul to soul is soul force. Now, if you want that story in detail because you like writing, then you can read my doctoral dissertation, and this is one chapter of my doctoral dissertation. Soul Force and Social Change, Gandhi and King. It's bad reading, but it's in print, and you can read it.
I'm really looking forward to reading it, sir. I'm very sure that it's going to be really insightful. And thank you so much for your wonderful lecture today. Sir, I have a question. I was seeing the other side of the coin also. Right now, of course, we have been discussing soul force and soul power. And even in Indian scriptures, they talk of ancient Indian rishis, the sages, who would who could, tame lions and other ferocious beasts. And then, of course, you told the story of Daniel and the lions. And but when you were telling, of course, that happens. Even now, if you want something from your heart and heart and soul, so it somehow starts manifesting. Uh, but when that, of course, I'm not denying that. But then history also has examples of people like of noble people like Socrates, even Christ, for that matter, and like. Of course, they must be having tremendous soul power. Like, for example, Socrates, he, stood for his ideals and he drank a cup of poison in the Senate. And likewise, Christ, he was crucified. When you were discussing all these examples, I was reminded of Dostoevsky, or Dostoevsky's lines, who says that you can understand the true calling of the soul through suffering. Do you think that's the other side of the coin? Like, of course, if you have soul power, you can tame evil forces, and I agree with you on that. But I also, think of all these great noble personalities who've suffered for being noble, for being honest people. There's so many examples from history. Uh, Cutting across cultures. Like, for example, in India also, you have goddess Sita, uh, like Lord Rama's consort, Socrates, Christ. So, of course, they must be also having tremendous soul power, but eventually, this had to sacrifice their lives in some way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
so suffering is also, I think, very important. God does. I mean, on the one hand, he saves noble souls, people with soul power. On the other hand, he makes them suffer as well. Because there are greater lessons to be learned through suffering.
Well, Gandhi would agree. Every problem is an opportunity. When you're suffering, it's an opportunity to feel and develop empathy for others. Always there's an opportunity. Gandhi would say, when you're getting into the higher levels of soul force, where you can tame lions, for example, and Gandhi never claimed to be able to do that. How do you get there? It is the way. Jesus could, Gandhi believed, have disarmed the Roman Empire. He had sufficiently the power of God. He could have literally made people beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. But that was not the purpose of Jesus, according to Gandhi. Jesus' purpose was to show us the way. And the way is the willingness to sacrifice and suffer and love those who do not love you. That's how you promote love in the world. That's how you destroy hate in the world. That's how you can stop the cycles of violence and violence and violence, hitting of the cheeks in the world. Gandhi was saying Jesus is a teacher. Many of these people, Socrates is a teacher. He is living and willing to die, as he says, we must be willing to live and die. And that is the way that you can truly live. That is the way that your soul merges into the Godhead. You achieve ultimate self-actualization or self-realization. And that gives a power to others that can change the course of history. I think
Thank you
many
so
people,
much for the
yeah.
answer, for the illuminating answer, sir.
Well, that's for most people, I think, who do not think Gandhi makes any sense. Many of these people do have great fear of death. And many do not believe that there is anything beyond death. You have only one life to live. How foolish are you, Gandhi, to say that I should be willing to suffer and die, throw my life away? For their point of view, Gandhi is kind of masochistic and foolish, but they don't share his worldview. I have shared his worldview with you, not to try to convert you, but to help you understand it. And if you understand, then you can agree or disagree with him. We don't need to have just disagreement based upon lack of understanding. So now we have completed a fairly complicated overview of Gandhi's worldview, his assumptions, beliefs, goals, strategies. And I am looking forward to seeing some of your summary observations coming to me by email. Any time between now and next Thursday would be good to receive your one paragraph reflections upon each of the sessions that we have had. That will give me some idea as to how to proceed. And next Thursday, I'll warn you ahead of time, we will be looking at specific guidelines for practicing Satyagraha. Very controversial guidelines. And we will have group discussions, I hope, relating to those. And there is where I suppose the rubber hits the road, where Gandhi's ideology, his worldview, is put to practice. Do you believe that you should keep secrets from your opponent? Gandhi believes in no secrecy. This is a big debate among organizers for just about any nonviolent action that I've been a part of. Should we not tell the police what we are doing? Well, if we tell them, they'll have an unfair advantage. These are debates where Gandhi's worldview makes it very clear where he stands, and where we might become a little more aware of our worldviews, where we discuss those guidelines for action. And maybe we disagree with Gandhi, that's okay. But let us look carefully, because that's where an organizer in this world undertaking the plans for an action here, you need to have guidelines. So do you like Gandhi's guidelines or not? That next Thursday. And in the meantime, I hope you have a very good few days and are able to cope with whatever problems that you may be facing during this time.